Director of the Columbia Institute for Tele-Information, longtime professor at Columbia, and
Recording in progress.
And I'm very pleased to open this session, to welcome everybody, to thank Bill Drake for organizing it, to thank Jason Buckwitz for managing it, and for our panelists to join us from distant locations. But partly because these locations are distant, I felt that perhaps I should also say a few words about the issue of disinformation from a more U.S. Free speech, First Amendment type perspective, because the concept of information integrity, frankly, and disinformation makes me somewhat nervous. And normally I'm the host, and so I will just introduce the topic, but here I have some opinions too. The problem with disinformation is, what is it? There's no specific legal meaning, at least not in the United States. There's usually, it means, I think, information or opinion we don't like, we don't agree with, we think it's harmful to what we believe in. There are, of course, some egregious cases, and those will be presumably shown as the argument for something of a regulatory nature, the egregious cases, but sometimes you throw in the baby with the bathwater, as I say, and you kind of, the remedy is worse than the disease. There is, after all, there is the right to say the earth is flat. There's no regulation that can prohibit you, at least not in the United States. There is the right to say that the world was created in 7 days. There is the right to say that Jesus walked on water. There is the right to say that inflation last year was 25% and that it's all Joe Biden's fault. Now, true, there are some exceptions: defamation, fraudulent advertising, financial misinformation, perjury, in some countries, hate speech. But disinformation brings us to another level because it is so vague. Governments, of course, like to regulate disinformation because it gives them a tool to control and to suppress speech by the opposition. And that's most easy to see for authoritarian governments. And then you go to the United Nations to legitimize this on an international level and to give an international stamp of approval. So in some countries, even kind of not so authoritarian, have used this as a tool. Singapore, for example, has used misinformation, disinformation, and characterized this as libels against government officials, and then kind of ruined them financially, publishers, newspapers, journalists, by using this vague tool. Even in democratic societies, or not so democratic, in the bad old days in the American South, before the U.S. Supreme Court, decided in Times versus Sullivan what defamation exactly means, it used the vague standards and the courts and the governments in those southern states to uphold segregation by claiming that people who argued against it were defaming or misrepresenting the truth. So how do we define disinformation? What are the criteria? And most importantly, who decides whether something is disinformation or not? And here, to me, kind of a good example of an alternative is Taiwan. Taiwan has a problem of disinformation, kind of fairly targeted from the People's Republic of China, or so they claim. And the question then is, what should they do about it? And the government actually had a law in place, a bill in place to outlaw and to restrict and to limit a whole bunch of informational practices. And in contrast, that law failed because of the opposition, given the history of the country against authoritarian rule. And so instead, what evolved was a civic society-oriented system of crowdsourcing disinformation and countering it with more speech, with more information, with pointing that it is incorrect rather than banning and regulating it. Now, in contrast, the EU has been edging towards a regulation. In the United States, I think that disinformation rules and regulations, many of them would fail unless really tightly circumscribed, would fail in the courts. Because they would have to meet at least four tests, a four-pronged test. First, that something is in fact disinformation. Secondly, that it has an impact, that the statement has an impact on something that is important and material. Thirdly, that any regulation actually reduces that impact. Fourth, that there are no unanticipated side consequences that are also restrictive due to that particular law or regulation. And fifth, there is no alternative that is less restrictive. And so once you go through these 4 or 5 different prongs of this test, there isn't going to be very much left. And so I think that the concept will be treated of information integrity, disinformation will be treated very differently in different countries around the world. And therefore, I'm really skeptical about even the notion that you can somehow structure an arrangement that would please both the United States and China, say. And so I'm perfectly happy to listen to this discussion, but I want to present right here at the beginning my skepticism about whether regulating disinformation is not worse than letting information, including disinformation, exist and counter it with more information. Thank you. And now, Bill, to you.
Oh, great. Well, thanks, Ellie. Interesting comments. And of course, I'm sure we will come back to that kind of freedom of expression type framing and skepticism about international governance efforts throughout this discussion. I'm sure many of us agree on a lot of points. The point, of course, of this meeting is not to advocate for international governance of disinformation, but rather to talk about what's going on and why governments are doing this and what are the prospects and what does it mean. So anyway, hello, everybody. Welcome to the 3rd year of our seminar series. I don't know if everyone here has been to some of them before. A number of the people I see here have. But we've covered a wide range of topics over the past couple of years. And the videos of all of our sessions are on the website for the series that's included in the announcement. Our final meeting of the semester will be Tuesday, December 12th. That's less than a month away because we're rushing for the holidays. And it'll be the first of several sessions on the governance of artificial intelligence. We'll look at the Council of Europe's Framework Convention on Artificial Intelligence and Human Rights, Democracy, and the Rule of Law, which is the first global treaty on AI. And among the speakers will be the chair of the negotiations, Ambassador Thomas Schneider from Switzerland. And we'll also have Mark Rotenberg from the Center for AI and Digital Policy and someone else. So it'll be a good session. So please join us for that on December 12th. So today we're talking about the terrible twins of disinformation and intergovernmental governance, seemingly a timely topic given the US election. It's an interesting case. Everyone knows about disinformation and has strong opinions about it. There's zillions of meetings and analyses of disinformation, et cetera. And yet, when it comes to what's going on in the international governance sphere, the fact that governments are doing a lot of stuff tends not to be well recognized or understood by a lot of people. Jeanette, who's one of our speakers today, and I co-organized an event at the IGF meeting in Kyoto last year on disinformation and internet governance, and we were not at all surprised to find that, in fact, a lot of people were not terribly aware of what was happening at the international level. But nevertheless, when governments are getting together and trying to do stuff, it is worth taking note of it, particularly in the context of a seminar series on global digital governance. So that's why we're here today. And for me, I view disinformation as part of a larger set of issues, which has to do with the efforts that have been very difficult over the past century and a half to establish widely supported global governance mechanisms for information content. You know, we've had lots of mechanisms to facilitate the establishment of international infrastructures to facilitate communications from the traditional telecom regime to the internet, but governments reaching agreement over what kind of information can go over networks and so on has always proven more difficult. Let me just flag quickly 5 different kinds of international cooperation we've seen. To set the table, at one end of the spectrum of choices, you have binding international agreements to suppress the cross-border dissemination of speech including disinformation that governments believe is harmful in some ways. And this has a hardy, long tradition that goes back to the beginnings of international cooperation and communications. The 1819 Carlsbad decrees of the German Confederation, for example, established a system of mutual censorship of information that state parties deemed contrary to their interests. The 1850 Treaty of the Austro-German Telegraph Union provided for state surveillance and stoppage of cross-border transmissions that were contrary to the public order. And that language actually has been carried forward into the ITU's constitution and is still with us today. It's part of international telecom law that states have the sovereign right to surveil, interrupt, and terminate any transmission that they deem contrary to their interests. 1937, the League of Nations had a convention on the use of broadcasting in the cause of peace, which also obliged states to suppress false statements likely to cause harm to good international understanding. So this has a long tradition. And today, of course, we see a lot of proposals for binding international regimes to suppress speech. For example, the 1998 proposal from Russia for an international code of conduct for information security, which by 2011 had co-sponsorship from China and a couple other states, which called for an international ban on disseminating information that incites terrorism, secessionism, extremism, et cetera, or undermines other countries' political, economic, or social stability or spiritual and cultural environments. So that's pretty expansive. Then, of course, the Russians were the driving force in pushing forward the effort to create a cybercrime treaty, which we've seen now has taken root in the United Nations this year. The original Russian draft for that treaty proposed international criminalization of the distribution of materials that call for illegal acts, which could be anything. And in 2023, China formally proposed to criminalize the publishing, distributing, and transmitting or otherwise making available of false information. So you see, there are certain countries that have taken a real shining to the idea that you could use international instruments to try to suppress speech that they found problematic, including what they deem to be disinformation. At the opposite end of the spectrum of options, we have binding international human rights agreements, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant of Human Rights from 1966, et cetera, which establishes a framework for tests to say, freedom of expression is paramount and violations of freedom of expression have to meet certain standards, et cetera. And the Human Rights Council, of course, has taken up many issues around disinformation and articulated a human rights orientation as well on these points in recent years. Somewhere between those poles of binding obligations to suppress and binding obligations to allow freedom of expression, we have a variety of different things happening. For example, co-regulatory approaches, such as have been followed by the European Union. The EU of 2018 had the Code of Practice on Disinformation, which is strengthened in 2022. Last time I looked, I'm not maybe up to date, it had 34 corporate signatories, including all the major online platforms who engaged in a series of commitments and to cut the financial incentives for spreading disinformation, to terminate fake accounts, establish all kinds of different kinds of checks and balances, and have regular reporting to governments about what they're doing, which has turned out to be rather mixed, of course. Mr. Musk dropped Twitter out of it, or X, whatever it's called. But it is tied to the Digital Services Act. There is the possibility of some kind of economic sanctioning. And of course, UNESCO also had guidelines on governance of digital platforms, which also kind of follows a sort of co-regulatory instinct as well, although perhaps a bit looser. We had a series about that in our seminar last year. Then we have, of course, international dialogues and information sharing and research, consensus building that happens in a wide variety of international forums, such as the IGF, the OECD, et cetera. And then finally, normative agreements and soft law. And this has been the one where there's a lot of activity, in particular of late. The UN General Assembly has adopted resolutions on countering disinformation while reaffirming freedom of expression. And then we've had this new trend of promoting so-called information integrity, a term that originates in the information security environment. And, it's the notion that, information integrity is variously described as promoting information that's accurate, trustworthy, reliable, and verifiable, and an information ecosystem that produces and supports it. States have been seeking to call for promoting such good information rather than seeking to suppress bad information. And the people that are particularly involved in this have been Democratic governments. The Biden administration has had a whole interagency working group on information integrity with a whole of government kind of approach, trying to coordinate federal activity around these issues. The Brazilian government and others have as well. And at the international level, Canada and the Netherlands led last year an international global declaration on information integrity that established certain kinds of obligations on members to not spread disinformation and to undertake certain types of steps consistent with human rights law to ensure that information was of high quality, et cetera. The Group of 20, which is, I think, meeting today, the summit, mentions it in their ministerial meeting. And perhaps most notably, the UN Secretary General passed a global set of global principles for information integrity, which originally was supposed to be a global code of conduct, but I think they backed off and they didn't get enough support for that. But nevertheless, it kind of has the same co-regulatory kind of instinct to it. It sets out a set of 5 principles, one of which is not human rights for some reason, which we should talk about. And then a set of ambitious calls to action directed to all the different actors, private sector, civil society, governments, about different things that they should do to undertake to increase the quality of information at the international level. It's unclear what will happen with that. The Secretary General has talked it up a lot and said that it's a priority of his, as has Melissa Fleming, who's the Undersecretary General, who runs the Department of Global Communications. But given the U.S. election and various other kinds of factors, how much they're going to really try and carry that forward, we'll see. But anyway, the point is there's a lot of activity then going on at the international level around the notion that there should be some sort of international rules of the game with regard to disinformation, or at least coordination. And we want to take stock of all that and say, what's going on? How noteworthy is it or not? How does it fit into the global digital landscape? So to do that, we have a great panel of people who have been very involved in these conversations. Guy Berger is Professor Emeritus of Journalism and Media Studies at Rhodes University and a Distinguished Research Fellow at the Research ICT Africa think tank for 11 years. Guy was a Senior Director at UNESCO, where he oversaw work on global communications and information policy and regulation. He recently was the lead author of 2 issue briefs on information integrity for the Group of 20 governments, and he joins us from South Africa. Maria Paz Canales is co-head of policy and advocacy at Global Partners Digital, a social purpose company working to enable a digital environment underpinned by human rights. Previously, she was the co-founder and executive director of Derechos Digitales, one of the first digital rights organizations in Latin America. And she's very engaged in processes around these issues in the UN and so on. And she's joining us from France on the border of Geneva. And Jeanette Hofmann is professor of digital policy at the Freie University of Berlin. I won't try to pronounce the German version. She is one of the founding directors of the Alexander von Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society and the head of the research group on politics of digitalization at the Berlin Social Science Research Center, and a principal investigator of the research group on technology, power, and domination at the Weizmann Institute on the Network Society in Berlin. And she joins us from Berlin. So we will have, as always, around 3 or 4 rounds of tour de table conversation among the panelists. And then at the top of the hour, we open it up to everybody in the room for a half hour of hopefully lively and vibrant conversation with everybody who's interested in speaking. So that's the game plan. So let's begin then. And let me start by asking the panel, just to get our appetites whetted, let's start with a big picture assessment of where you are with governance responses to disinformation around the world. When we look at the policy discourses in play around governance, what are some of the dominant assumptions that seem to shape how policymakers frame and respond to disinformation, how they're thinking about the sources and distribution channels and audiences and impacts? In other words, how are they kind of conceptually constructing the issue space? And how are those assumptions reflected in the policy responses they've undertaken? I think we can start there, and then we'll move into the information integrity and the international stuff. So let's just go in alphabetical order. Why don't we start with Guy? Guy, why don't you start us off?
Sure, thanks, Bill. Let me begin by just pushing back against Ellie, partially for debate, but partially because it's relevant to this. the assumptions that Ellie presented there was that this concept is problematic because you can't come with a tight legal definition, or if you do, it would be restrictive. And I think that you would only need that tight legal definition if you take a legalistic point of view and you take the view that governance equates to governments. And governments, of course, are supposed to work according to law. But this issue of disinformation is a governance issue. Now, what that means is that, you're looking for concepts that the whole of society can deal with, not just governments. And even so, I would just point out that if you avoid any interest in governance of this, you're basically saying a free market continues. And the free market, as we know, is a pretty dire market at the moment from the point of view of people who are on the receiving end of that. I don't need to mention recent events in your country, but to the extent that you think that you could have a situation where regulation of speech would never pass muster in your courts, watch that space, because you have a president who can pack courts for the next significant period. And the kind of current push for free market, the kind of deregulation approach to this whole thing means that those in power stay in power in terms of their control of the means of expression, and to enforce against what they call the censorship industrial complex. I can foresee quite a range of steps coming out that could be contested in your courts, but could also be enforced by your courts if your courts change. So I think we've got to get away from this point of view of just saying that, the courts are supreme, this is a legal issue. We've got to take it a much wider perspective. Then I would also say, even, Bill, in response to your point that there are some binding things in the UN system, what you referred to is, in particular, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. This is not really binding in the sense of hard law. It's a soft law. And if you look at the international system, it works primarily on soft law. So if you're talking about a concept like terrorism, I mean, there's no internationally agreed definition of terrorism. Like all definitions, it's contested. And yet, it's kind of used in a vague and woolly sense, which can be very negative at times for suppressing dissent and for violating legitimate freedom of expression. But the point is, the international community comes around a certain concept. It doesn't have to be narrowly defined, because that's how the UN system works. So I just wanted to make those points. Then I also wanted to say is that you always will have this issue, even in law, but certainly in the international system, about the general and the specific. So in terms of the general right to freedom of expression, as you said, Bill, the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights says that it can be restricted, not violated, restricted, there's a difference, but restricted only under certain conditions, which I don't know if I need to. Well, let me just say quickly, must be necessary, must be proportionate, must be in writing, or must be predictable, and must be for legitimate purpose. And as you may know, Susan Benesch has the concept of dangerous speech. She's elaborated on conditions on this. The rebut plan of action by the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner has also elaborated on these things. So they have got, at that normative level, safeguards on restrictions. Now, the last point I would want to make here is that when you're speaking about governance and even governments, you don't have to speak about this in the sense of restrictions only. In fact, you can deal with these things in an enabling way. So the most obvious thing is that you may want to say, rather than shut down certain kinds of speech, you want to enable other kinds of speech. So, I mean, you have an example in your country, and kudos to you. You compel speech on cigarette packaging. Okay, many platforms involved in speech in the sense of enabling certain kinds of speech or labeling and so on and so forth. Then you can go further. You can have enabling public service broadcasting. You can have enabling access to information. You can have enabling media and information literacy. So we've got to get away from governance as just being governments who are trying to, in the abstract, tie the hands of the good fighters for freedom of expression. We've got to see this in a much more all-rounded way, which I think the concept of information integrity can help us do. But we'll come to that later, I understand. So I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Thanks, Guy. And there's some good provocations in there. To start with, Maria, your thoughts on, again, I was just thinking about how are policy makers constructing this space, and how are they trying to frame it in order to shape the responses, how they represent the question of disinformation. Your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Bill. Happy to be here today sharing and adding to the kind of making spicy the conversation. So I'm going to try to support a little bit of what Ellie mentioned and trying to be provocative with some of the thought that Guy just shared with us, but also doing it from the angle that Bill is asking to me, like in taking a deeper look on how this look like when it's actually captured in the narrative of different governments around the world and use it in a political way also. So in terms of like the elements of reaction for the two previous interventions, what I want to highlight is that I agree very much with Guy that this is a governance issue and not just a government issues. And from that perspective, initially the concept of like disinformation, misinformation, and later on information integrity can be very attractive in terms of like capturing the imaginary and the things that people feel as real issues in their own social and political realities, with something that can be attractive to engage with for conversation for governance. It's very dangerous in my perspective in eroding all the good protection anchored in freedom of expression that Guy also mentioned it in the UN system, and Ellie was mentioning particularly for the case of the US with the First Amendment protection. So my main concern about the definition or the concept of the use of the word of disinformation is that like what it can make in terms of eroding the common understanding that we already have about what are the basic rules for promoting and protecting freedom of expression and what are the permissible exceptions that can be allowed, and on that, like all what Guy already was mentioning regarding, for example, hate speech issues that had been laid out in the Rabat plan. But going to answer the question that Bill was posed, my main concern as being a practitioner that have been working in these issues from the global majority perspective, the global south, particularly in Latin America, in my previous experience as executive director of the Derechos Digitales, is seeing how the use of the concept of disinformation and the aim to enter to some regulatory action or even co-regulatory action in this field is weaponizing from many governments around the world in order to really crush dissent political views that are not aligned with the people that is currently in power. So at the end, again, like in this mess of like not having a specific definition of the disinformation and substituting the discussion around disinformation and the measures that can be taken rather than talking about what is permissible in terms of restriction of freedom of expression, provide them many cases plenty of space for having this very aggressive approach, either like directing regulation for protecting their own interests, or also like making heavy regulation for putting a lot of responsibility in the intermediaries in the platform for making decisions about what is disinformation and what is not. And there also I want to make a point in terms of like this consideration that many times we lose of sight that into freedom of expression, we have like freedom of expression, access to information, but also freedom of opinion. So even though many of the measures that had been encouraged by local policies and even some of the international cooperation effort that Bill described at the beginning of this conversation, are looking into how to separate the true from the false. What are the reliable sources and which one we should not trust with? And these are very contentious issues, because that lose of sight that there are a bucket of elements in the exercise of freedom of expression and freedom of opinion, specifically, that are not able to be framed in that way in judgment of truthfulness or not. So I think that this is very relevant, because like when we encounter this conversation around disinformation, a lot of government try to simplify the discussion and to put everything in the same bucket. And I think that these are very relevant difference in terms of the standards and the rules and the type of measure that can be encountered that are very much allowing to enrich and to reinforce the idea of having a pluralistic information environment that allows that each one of the citizens or the users of the different digital channels of information can make a responsible consume of the information, and they are the ones that are deciding what are the information that they want to trust more or not. So I think that coming back also to some elements of agreement that I have regarding what Guy was mentioning in his intervention, I think that one positive side is that if we look into many of the instruments that Bill mentioned at the beginning related to international cooperation, what we are seeing is that in general, they tend to focus more than in the issue of restriction. They tend to focus in this positive aspect and that Guy was mentioning, like what we can do for improving the quality of the information environment. So focusing, if we see, for example, from the UN principles, and if we see also in what was captured in the Global Digital Compact, we see a commitment with digital literacy. We see a commitment with the creation of a sustainable environment that is pluralistic. So those kinds of measures talk about what Guy was mentioning, governance that focus in providing the right incentive for the information ecosystem to be healthy. And I think that that's a good sign. It is a challenge because usually this is like the long run. This is not the effective way to do it if you want to be politically popular in a country, because when a bad thing happens as the results of election in government that are authoritarian or restrictive of the exercise of right, people look into what else could be done in the realm of governance of digital platform for avoiding that these information disorders, as I like to call them, happen. But at the end, these long-run measures we see are the only ones that are more able to deal with this important question without stepping into the foot of the principles and the guidance that already exists in terms of what can be done for restricting freedom of expression. I'll stop there for continue the conversation.
Great, thank you, Maria. Jeanette, your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you very much, Bill. I'd like to start by reminding us how very recent the term disinformation actually is. It became popular only in 2016 with two events that were both considered earth-shaking, the Brexit outcome and the US election. Both events came up with different results than everybody was expected, and the world started searching for explanations. And one of the explanations people came up with was evil Russia, evil China, trying to manipulate the innocent democratic countries, trying to self-determine their fate. And after that, after 2016, we really saw an explosion in research and publications. and in public debates about this new threat to the digital world, disinformation. And the main contenders that were identified again and again were Russia, China, and social networks. Social networks today are regarded, at least where I live, as the main cause of disinformation. And to me, this is sort of like blaming the messenger. And I find it really dangerous, this link between disinformation and social networks, because it means to me systematically looking in the wrong direction. Disinformation, the way I see it, I mean, at least when we talk about threats to democracy, does not come from platforms. And even if it comes from Russia and China, these are not the main threats. The main threats are coming from above, from populist leaders such as Trump, Bolsonaro, the Kaczynski brothers in Poland, Boris Johnson in the UK, you name it. And I can say that there are empirical data that actually confirm this, that disinformation is prevalent first in autocratic countries and in democratic countries that are on the tipping point of turning into either illiberal democracies such as Hungary with Orban, or countries that are on the tipping point of autocratizing, like the US. And here you can see that populist leaders, but also political parties that have a populist agenda, use disinformation as a tool to communicate. It's a form of political communication. And that wouldn't be a problem if not their supporters held them to account, but they don't. And that is the question that I personally find most interesting, why so many people don't mind that their political leaders use open lies that clearly lack any evidence, that they don't mind, but on the contrary, even cheer to these kind of lies. When you see sort of the development of the Republican Party and its response to the rigged election, you can see that today every member of the Republican Party in the US has to sort of assent with that observation. You are becoming sidelined if you don't. What you see here is, in my mind, that information has become part of a power play where it's political power that determines what is trustworthy and not, say, professional journalistic or academic standards. And that is what I find really threatening, that a growing number of people really doesn't care anymore. They might care in private, as a scholar said, whether the weather will be good tomorrow or whether the bus actually leaves at 10:15 or not. So on that basis, people still care about facts, but not when it comes to political communication and sort of explaining the world. And that is something that is completely under-investigated in our debate about disinformation. Coming back to the big picture, there are studies from the Variety of Democracy report, this big project in Sweden that observes many, worldwide democracy already over a long time. And they have data of the fact that disinformation is really prevalent in countries where democracy is weakening. It's these countries where people sort of apparently feel alienated from their governments and turn into these, what I would call, fringe beliefs and counter narratives. And they showed us also for their latest report in 2024. So when people say that disinformation is threatening democracy, I would say it's actually the other way around. Disinformation has become a symptom for eroding democracies. And that is my problem diagnosis. Perhaps one last point I want to make. The American political theorist, Lisa Dish, in her latest book, she had a chapter on disinformation, and she makes the point, starting from how disinformation is typically defined, that it's about deliberately manipulating people. She says that manipulation has always been part of the political rhetoric. That is nothing new, and therefore also difficult to distinguish sort of between normal, acceptable manipulation and non-acceptable manipulation. But she says people usually can handle that kind of political lies and forms of trying to convince voters. What they can't handle is circumstances where there is no way anymore of dispute disinformation. And her example is the Iraq War, the way the US government, together with the British government, walked the country into a war where people had no possibility to dispute what the government told them. Again, it's the government that was the one that sort of spread disinformation. And in this case, it was not part of a public debate where you have sort of other actors saying, no, I don't believe this, or sort of here is counter evidence. That was not possible. And she says, this is the kind of disinformation we have to be aware of, because in that case, sort of all forms of digital literacy don't help. That's my point of view.
Great. Thanks, Jeanette. We have just a shy of 20 minutes before we open to the floor, so we want to try and go a little bit quicker through just two more rounds of questions. So if we can be concise on this. The first one, coming back to this notion of information integrity. I mean, my question is, here we have all the industrialized democracies and some other democracies putting forward this idea, the governments, with support from various stakeholders, that, you know, rather than focusing on suppressing bad speech, we're going to up the level of good speech by conceptualizing a good information environment, establishing metrics for it, and then trying to positively promote it. How useful do you think this is analytically in addressing this realm? And from a political standpoint, does it help? Does it provide governments with a better way into this difficult space? If we could just talk about that briefly, then I just want to ask about thoughts on the international agreements to wrap it up. So let's go again, same order. Guy, you've written about information integrity for the G20 governments here. What do you think about the contribution and the utility of this concept?
So I think this is an umbrella concept which can encompass a lot of things, one of which is the fight against disinformation, whether you want that fight to be through fact-checking, debunking, pre-bunking, or whether you want that fight to be through taking action when people produce disinformation to defraud pensioners out of their income and so on. But the thing is, because it's an umbrella term, it can help by contextualizing fights against disinformation as one particular battle and a battle for something rather than just against something. So you're not just against lies and cheats, you are in favor of something. And so I think framing it like that is quite important. And then, as I've been trying to say, that well, sorry, let me just make a slightly different point now. So I think there's positives to it. And as I said, it's governance that they can cover a range of enabling things besides some restrictive things. And I think you want to restrict things because you want to restrict, for example, non-consensual sexual imagery, which even if the majority of people seem to be happy to see it produced, distributed, and consume it, the point is it's about individual rights that trump. Sorry to use the word, but the individual rights of the individual people affected here and their ability to speak freely in society is being overwhelmed by this kind of thing. Anyway, but I wanted to express a little reservation about this concept of information integrity, because although it includes the restrictive and the enabling range of activities, and I think there's space for both, and I think it does need to be based on the bottom line of freedom of expression, international covenants of civil rights, but it's a bit of a narrow standard because, as you said, Bill, it comes from IT. It's not really a concept that translates that easily into the social sphere, as various people have pointed out. And it implies a kind of I would say, a sort of a methodological positivism, that you can have, pure facts, you can have, accuracy just in the abstract. And yes, you can speak about that in the technical sense in terms of IT, but when you're looking at society, I think you're looking at facts, but facts never exist in isolation of other facts, and together it makes for narratives. And whatever informational content there is, there's also a huge amount of effective content that's bundled together. Only abstractly can you separate these. And so you're not going to understand that, the role of ideology, the role of, I suppose, identity construction, of manipulation of narratives, if you're only going to stick with a kind of pure positivistic thing that, yes, this is scientifically proven fact, and that is not. Because you also have, as we know from COVID, you have a range of things where some things were quite clear and some things were still gray. And so we need to be careful that this information integrity doesn't get limited down to the kind of technical accuracy dimension. And we need to be careful that it is not hijacked into restricting legitimate freedom of speech, in the same way that concept of fake news was co-opted. The concept of information integrity could be weaponized easily as well. And the fact that governments have agreed on it at a broad norm, super. But we need to keep on pushing back and saying you cannot cherry pick under information integrity. You cannot leave out freedom of expression. You cannot only focus on restrictions. Your restrictions must be according to international standards. You have to have enabling provisions for information integrity. So that's my contribution there. Back to you.
Great. Thank you, Guy. Maria, we've got a few minutes left.
Yeah. Again, for taking it where Guy left it, I think that going in this direction of avoiding information integrity to be cherry-picked and used for legitimate things that are incompatible with the exercise of freedom of expression. I think that one particular concern that I have heard a lot from my colleagues from the global majority or global south, whatever you want to call it, is that the element behind this information integrity concept coming from the security, as you have described it before, is assuming there was a previous state of integrity of the information. So we want to restore it and we want to keep it. And this is not the reality for many places on the world. So many of, for example, even the positive things that are being proposed in going into support this information integrity can be very problematic in some different contexts. I put the most clear example for me, fact-checking. Fact-checking that will be something that in general is supported and recommended in many places that have a democratic structure, freedom of press, and not intervention from governments in the developing of media can be very controversial in many places around the world in which these conditions don't happen, in which the use of fact-checking is precisely the weaponization that government can do for controlling the information ecosystem. So this is kind of the things that we need to pay attention when we are talking about information integrity and promoting. Again, the devil is in the details. The positive concept is something to praise. The same that we were talking about, the positive approach on addressing the concerns around this information. But the problem is that taking for granted certain elements in society, it can be very dangerous in many places around the world. So for being mindful of time, I will stop here this round. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. And Jeanette.
Yeah, thank you. I have to confess, I really, really dislike this term, information integrity. As you said before, it comes from the security world and it feels like a securitization of the public sphere to me. Normatively, I would say it sounds like a hodgepodge of human rights and some other standards that have nothing to do with what I would call public discourse, sort of this matter of accuracy. As Eli said before, we all have the right to say the earth is flat. That is not accurate. Does it then make it information that is unhealthy for the new ecosystem that we talk about? So what is part of the problem, I think, of this new language that we introduced, that it does not reflect public discourse, it does not reflect clash of opinions and beliefs, and it sort of works, the kind of language works both for democracies and for autocracies. Some people have started to write about the pathologizing of the public sphere and what it means if healthiness becomes a standard that all governments agree to. Would we, for example, say that the election campaigns by Trump, that they're healthy? Who is going to define what is healthy in the future? Is it Trump himself who defines that for the public media? I'm not sure. I looked also at the new codes of conduct and texts that are formulated around it, and I came up with a public consultation that the OECD just published a few weeks ago. And there it says, promoting the accessibility and free flow of high quality evidence-based information is key to upholding the human rights of freedom of opinion and expression. What is that supposed to mean? That we all now have to produce facts when we talk in public, or that there will be someone who monitors the kind of quality that our debate today has? I find that it makes me really shudder, that kind of language. I had a student ask to look at how this language made it into UN organizations. It is also fairly recent. It only came around 2020. And since then, many governments have picked it up. And I find that really suspicious. If I was a believer in conspiracy theories, I would smell a bad rat here.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jeanette. Well, I was going to do another round to talk about the specific international frameworks that have been put forward, in particular, because I'm particularly interested in the fact that the Secretary General of the UN is pushing this information integrity concept, and that all these other governments have done this as well. I mean, I think the probably good liberals in the Canadian and Dutch governments that push forward this global declaration be surprised to hear our views on information integrity, but nevertheless, but I see a lot of interesting people in the audience. So I think in a larger group here. So I think I'd rather open it to the floor, and we can come back to some of the international issues in the context of a larger discussion as we go. But so I'd like to see if any of the folks that are here with us would like to raise their hand and first of all, of course, introduce yourself and contribute to the conversation. The real value of this series, I think, is that we try, instead of doing one of those series where you have just a bunch of panelists who talk forever and everybody else sits there, we try to make this an open conversation for everybody who joins the call. So any and all inputs from folks in the room, just raise your hand and say whatever you'd like. Who would like to get us started? Some people have been chatting in the chat. I don't know if anybody wants to contribute based on that. Or if not, okay, sure, go ahead, Leonard. And turn your sound on, Len.
Uncharacteristic of me to be mute. So as a Canadian, let me see, you mentioned Canadian endeavors in this. I don't think we could all sit around and agree what a fact is. The world was flat for a long time, and people who said it was round were heretics, right? So what's a fact? Changes first. And second, there's a wonderful book, 2016, The Square and the Tower by Niall Ferguson, which is entitled Networks and Power, The Freemasons to Facebook. And in that, he talks about basically about disinformation was always there. Think of a world where there is no internet. Think of a rumor. Think of a group of friends and how a rumor spreads, which is completely false, but it spreads. You don't need the internet for falsehoods. So, I think that we've got to be very careful that free speech is paramount here, and we don't want to. To me, I view all these things with great suspicion as to who's going to tell me what is misinformation or not. And I know my grandchildren do read news on Twitter. I consider that odd. But, I think when my father looked at me reading some newspapers, he thought I was odd too. So I don't know how much that adds, but that's it.
Thanks, Len. We're going to stick with the Canadian theme and go to Marita. Hi.
Hi there. Marita Mall speaking. Yes, Canadian, but in Germany at the moment. So getting my information from all different parts of the world. I wanted to ask the panelists, how do you see the difference between misinformation and propaganda? Like the whole Iraq situation, the whole Iraq example. Yeah, that was terrible, but I never really looked at that as misinformation. I thought that was really just propaganda on the part of, the Bush government at the time. But I mean, maybe it's a scale. I don't know. I'm having a little trouble sort of figuring out what would be the difference, or is there a difference? Maybe there isn't. It's just a question of degree.
Great, thanks. The whole question of propaganda is actually it's kind of like a circle that overlaps heavily with disinformation. Some people use the terms interchangeably, but there's a long history of dealing with the notion of propaganda, which of course is intentional. But okay, panelists, who would like to start? We could just go in the same order, or just whoever wants to raise their hand and speak to it, let me know. Guy, do you want to say something, or should I come to Jeanette? Sorry, Jeanette, start with you.
Yeah, I try to look at that. There is hardly any work online that you find today that looks at these concepts in parallel. And I think that has to do with the fact that the young generation of communication scholars, they all look at the internet and they have a kind of ahistorical approach to things like disinformation. They would certainly agree that it has always been around, but since they look at new digital tools, they don't look at older concepts that around propaganda, for example, and the few pieces of literature that you find, they associate propaganda with systematic state-led disinformation, I would say. But the term disinformation, as I said, is so recent that there's hardly any work looking at these concepts in a comparative ways.
It is interesting how ahistorical a lot of analysis and discussion of these topics is. I mean, yes, propaganda, of course, has a very long history. And of course, I started out by talking about the Carlsbad Decree. So other panelists who'd like to get
I think what is different now is, and I disagree with Jeanette, is the fact that the platforms for distribution are obviously historically very different. They're certainly not neutral in terms of their commissions and their omissions. And I do fear that with the Musk effect, you're going to see platforms doing even less content moderation because they can get away with it and it's cost them less money. So that is different. And I think that is part of the thing that brings me to respond to the first comment there, that it's not about the taking away people's right to speak bullshit at all. It's a question of so how do you stop that bullshit from flooding the zone? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's really what it's about. And in some cases, that bullshit may be so serious and so dangerous you want to restrict it. But in other cases, what you're really looking at is the total content mix. And in that mix, making sure that, for example, journalism is not overshadowed, undermined, attacked with impunity, which is what is happening. I mean, so people are exposed to an incredible amount of misleading content, which is also effective content, which makes it propaganda in my perspective. And are we going to sit there and just let this carry on? And by the way, I'd want to say also that as we move more and more into this generative AI hype and so on, that the question of having information that actually is accurate and reliable becomes more and more important. Otherwise, we're going to be in a spiral here where we get more bullshit that's feeding into new bullshit. I don't know if I can swear on your seminar, not swearing, but to use profanities.
We don't censor here.
We have to take this seriously, and it's not about stopping flat Earth people if they want to be as stupid as that. That's their right to be. But if somebody starts saying, I'm going to double your money if you invest here, and does so and cons people into that, or if somebody else says, take bleach, it's going to, really, fix your COVID condition, whatever. Those are quite serious things that we need to, figure out how we're going to deal with them. You can't just let a free market go there. You've got to produce information as a public good that can counter that. And so I think that's where this information integrity thing is useful, because it's not just a fight against bullshit. It's also saying, let's change the mix, the total content mix, because it's running away with us, thanks to the incentives of the platforms and to big AI as well.
And I think it is important that we, in order to not be ahistorical, do recognize the centrality of the platforms in the ways in which this has changed. I mean, the flooding of the zone is at a monumental level, and we now have, of course, the commercialization of corrupted information. I mean, you've got company, you've got, it's a business, right? I mean, it's just a massive amount of engagement there. And that does make things different from before. We'll come to Maria, and then I see several people have their hands up, which is great. So Maria, just a response on this point about the interplay with propaganda?
Yeah, I mean, I am not expert in propaganda, so I will provide my take from that perspective. I think that there are some clear guidance in terms of limitation of propaganda that have come from previous experience that is not related with the digital world, which again relate to the conditions in which freedom of expression can be limited. So the incitement of violence, that kind of things that usually can be covered by propaganda, by the type of propaganda that it was referred in the question. So there are some guidance, and I think that again, like the new thing is what Guy was referring. So the scale in which the platform allowed this, but if we want to take like a regulatory measure that go in limiting the circulation of certain outrageous, the biggest bullshit content that we can, there are some rules and there are elements that are pre-existent of the digital world, and they are still valuable for guiding that. For the other stuff, I think that again, from my perspective, and this opened a whole box of discussion that I don't know how much time we will go for going in that way, which is like talking about the incentive for the circulation of the information. So I get what Guy is saying about like not leaving this to the decision of the free market, but in the same way, I think then we should be working in the incentives that are being provided for the platform service to privilege the circulation of this type of content that we consider that can be harmful for society. So I think that the focus should not be in the regulation of like what negative content is, but rather in what the incentives that we are inserting in the governance of platform for privileging the exposure of certain type of content. And that's a totally different conversation that not necessarily, I mean, if we want to talk about information integrity in that context, I will feel much more comfortable of doing it in the context of economic incentive rather than doing it in the context of judging the value or the accuracy of information.
Right. Thanks, Maria. Okay. This platform thing is, I think, interesting in this context because if you actually look at what a lot of the activity coming from governments at the international level is focused on, they're not focusing so much on, I mean, no, they almost never kind of really recognize the extent to which states actors are actually the producers of a lot of this information. They put all the responsibility on the platforms. So the UNESCO platform framework and the way the Guterres thing, I mean, it's all about, the platforms need to do X, and the European approach has done the same thing, which I think is kind of interesting. We have 3 people who have raised their hands, Dwight, Laura, and Ellie. Let's take them in order. Dwight, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think one of the greatest challenges to management and the establishment of information integrity rests with the effective management of what I call youth-driven generations of Generation Z and the Alpha generation coming up. Because these 2 generations pretty much rely on what I call adolescent value judgments that are pretty much distributed through various social media laced information that they get on YouTube and other platforms. I was amazed. I was watching a documentary on Hulu about an individual who forming a New Yorker who is 19 years old, and I think Ellie probably knows what I'm talking about. There's a rapper by the name of Shine who did 10 years of prison based on a crime committed some years ago in New York City, and he's from Belize. He is now running for the position of Prime Minister of Belize, and he has a documentary that's very popular on Hulu now, talking about how much he learned about government and the management of people and the management of governments that he plans to employ in a very positive way in strengthening the governmental position and the value of management of the people, his relatives on the island of Belize. And as a professor here in Washington, D.C. at an HBCU, I'm beginning to see more and more young people who are not reading books. They're not even in communication majors. They're not even paying attention to the traditional sources of news that all of us are, have sort of grown up on, and they're relying on digital nomads and other people who are providing very unconventional points of view about what is appropriate information and or propaganda, whatever you want to give the name. So I think with the election of Donald Trump and what he promises to bring, I think we're in sort of a deep amount of trouble here in the management of our future leaders.
Yeah. The demographic aspect of this, I think, is important as a role of the youths and the manosphere. I didn't even know about the manosphere. Why don't we take 3 interventions and then come back to the panel for integrated responses so that we get more people speaking. So could people say who they are too when they introduce themselves? Laura, go ahead.
Thanks, Bill, and hi, everyone. My name is Laura DiNardis, and I'm really enjoying this discussion. Thank you very much. And my question is beneath content a little bit. So I really want to acknowledge the challenges that everyone said, and they're made worse by things like algorithmic ordering and social engineering techniques, and people literally being tricked by bots, not necessarily actual people, fake people, all like fakes all the way down the stack, including how we get hacked. And I want to tie this in particular to this group, which knows a lot about multi-stakeholder governance. And I want to ask the question of how to bring that multi-stakeholder governance, not governments, but governance into all of us, and targeting what people, I don't like the term digital literacy. I don't use that. But the question is, how can we move this into the receiver of information and the receiver of all of this manipulation? And, literally, what can people do to help make this a more, I don't like to use the word truth either, but to solve some of the problems that were described. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the multi-stakeholder dimension is one we definitely want to talk about as well, for sure, Laura. So thanks for that. And then Ellie, you're.
So I really enjoyed this conversation. And my problem is that while we can wring our hands about disinformation and fake news and despise it, whatever, the question is, what are we going to do about it? And the options that I see are kind of government, which leads to regulatory and censorship type arrangements almost inevitably. Or we can leave it to the platforms to filter and screen. And that gives these platforms even more power than they now have and create a global censorship regime. Or we can have this crowdsourcing, but that also leads to manipulation because you can organize a small crowd and you can kind of like a flash mob that somehow disputes information and makes it go away. So it seems to me that the best way to go would be some form of the trusted intermediaries, which is ultimately what newspapers used to be, which is some people who you trust, who will filter the information and present it to you. And you can choose which of these trusted intermediaries you would go. That, of course, has the danger of stratification along political lines and otherwise. And then there might be a technology solution, AI, a personal AI agent that filters information that works for you. So I'm not quite sure. I'm asking the panel now, if there's a clear case of disinformation, let's just stipulate those facts. It's clear that it's wrong and manipulative. So what are you going to do about it? Especially if it comes from a politician, what are you going to do about it?
Thanks, Ali. I imagine that MAGA will produce a variety of trusted agents that could be employed by people to keep them in the filter bubble. All right, so look, we've got people put on the table the concepts of platforms and the need for us to take the specificity of the kind of industrial scale of all this into account, the notion of demographics and the populations involved, the multi-stakeholder dimension, and in terms of looking for solutions, and Ellie suggested around intermediaries and whether that can be a part of solutions. Let's just go back around the horn. So let's start again with Guy. Your thoughts on whichever of those bits you'd like to respond to.
Sure. So you said, Bill, that governments are focusing on the platforms. They don't want to focus on the so-called bad actors because they themselves are bad actors. I don't quite agree with you because in many parts of the world, they do focus on what they define as bad actors. And in fact, they leave the platform scot-free. And I've seen this directly in South Africa, where they've taken action against people threatening violence in the South African election. But in the meantime, the platforms that make this feasible and amplify it, are left without any sanction. So that to me is something to keep in mind. Now, as to the second question by Laura, hello, Laura. We met you in Salerno. I wanted to say that this multi-stakeholder governance is really key because it ties a bit with what Ellie said. If you don't want governments and you don't want platforms, well, then you have to look at what other kinds of mechanisms there are. And these UNESCO guidelines for governing digital platforms, which I was involved in before I retired at UNESCO, they received quite a lot of pushback from civil society because they were proposing, in amongst other things, regulation. And when in the face of this pushback, they said two things. Regulation must be independent and it must be multi-stakeholder. Now, those are lovely ideals and so on. What does it mean? Well, you've got to then take this to the ground and thrash it out in a particular country. So you've got to have a regulator that is then not reporting directly to government. You've got to have a regulator that has built-in multi-stakeholder participation, monitoring, review. And I would also say that what you need here is not a regulator to necessarily be focused only on the kind of content issues because we know the risks of that, but there's a lot of other issues. You have competition regulators, you have consumer regulators, you have privacy regulation. These are all really important parts of this ecosystem because they all impact on what's happening in the content ecosystem. And I think what's important, particularly around trying to get a solution to this is data access. Disclosure, I'm convener of a group called the African Alliance for Access to Data. You may know that in the EU, people have access to data, legally speaking, from the platforms to study systemic risks. In the US, it's a voluntary thing. Who knows if it will continue. In Africa, you don't have any access. So that means you can't actually monitor who the bad actors are, nor can you monitor what is the platform's role in terms of curbing or amplifying the kind of content that can be existentially risky to elections, for example. So that's another part of the regulatory thing you've got to fit in. And who are the people who use access to data? Of course, intelligence services would love to have access to data, and they may use it for bad purposes. But your civil society, your media, and your journalists, these are people who can really use access to data to have much more accountability in that system, and also begin to provide intelligence so that one can figure out how to counterbalance, how to get reform in the platform practices, how to critique government for overreach, and so on, once you can start getting access to data. Thank you.
I'm talking with my mute on. The question of the, even pros make mistakes. The question of scholarly access to the research, to the data for research and so on, is actually part of both the Global Declaration and the Guterres things, trying to encourage platforms to divulge, make that information, and the UNESCO as well, yeah. Okay, but there are a number of other points on the table as well that we've talked about. Maria, you want to pick up any of those themes?
Yeah. Only for also adding my +1 to the access to data for researchers. This is an aspect that also from GPD we have been working on with the partners from Global South, in kind of understanding better how those kind of provision can be leveraged. The existing one, like the Article 40 of the European regulation, but also this discussion are starting to happen in the context of platform regulation discussion at the local level in different Global South countries. So we are very much keen to support continuing this discussion and engagement and collaboration between Global South and Global North civil society and researchers in this topic. So just for making the pitch, if anyone is interested in follow up that line of conversation. And then in the other question that were posed before, I want to make a point related to the ability to identify the provenance of information. I think that a lot of the idea that Eli was kind of alluding when he was referring to the role of journalists or the media, traditional media, in terms of being trusted intermediary. I think that it's a way in which we tend to understand in the past the possibility of identifying where an information was coming from. So now what we have in the digital sphere is that reference had been lost, because before we knew this channel or this newspaper was adhering to certain ideological views or political perspective, and this is lost in the digital sphere with the circulation of information. So I think that the idea of putting better focus, going to answer the question that Eli was posing in terms of where to focus the regulatory attention or the places in which governance can be worked out at the local level, but also in the more global international cooperation sphere. I would say being more concrete in terms of how we can address the issue of content provenance, it would be something very useful. And this is also applicable for the role of artificial intelligence that was alluded a couple of minutes ago for another speaker. I think that the more pervasive the artificial intelligence interference in the information ecosystem will become, more relevant. Again, it's the idea of being able to track the provenance of information, if it is a real human or a digital agent who is behind the production of information. And the second one, I will say that it's the issue of incentive for platforms. Again, like we don't want them to become the ones that are judging the accuracy or the quality of information, but we want them to have the right information for not continue to making viral things that are of not clear origins or that have behind political intentions or specific agendas that need to be clear for the user when they are encountering the information. I'll stop there. Sorry, no. One last point in the multi-stakeholder point, just +1 in terms of what Guy was mentioning related to the UNESCO guideline. This was a part in which GPD also engaged very hard. And also we are continuing now supporting the implementation of the UNESCO guidelines in different regions of the world with a couple of partners in the global south. And we think that ensuring the participation of civil society and a broader set of stakeholders at the local level is the only way in which we can get right the combination of measures according to the different contexts that I have been highlighting in my intervention before. I will stop there now.
Thanks. This tracking the provenance of information is actually a big part of it. I don't know if anybody else has read the White House guidelines on information integrity and what the administration was trying to do under Biden, but trying to track where it comes from and how it develops through the chain has been one of the things that they've been emphasizing. Jeanette, I don't know which of those pieces you'd like to pick up on. There's a number of different ideas on the table, but go for it.
There are actually several things I wanted to mention. First, what this article says and what the platforms also themselves have said several times, particularly the platforms that have been longer around, like YouTube. They've changed their algorithmic settings really fundamentally for the single reason that the companies who advertise on these platforms said, if I ever see hate speech or disinformation again next to my advertisement, you lose me as a client. They were forced for commercial reasons to work on their algorithms, and they did. What this article says is that algorithms with most platforms have a moderating function today, not a radicalizing function. And the people who radicalize themselves, they do this despite the algorithms. That's what this article from 224 says. What my own take on things is that all these fact-checking and digital literacy initiatives will not achieve is make people not disseminate and consume disinformation if they choose to do so. And there are two reasons why many people do so. One is because disinformation is a form of flagging association with certain groups, and it is a form of signaling support for populist leaders. It's not necessarily the information quality that's the point here. It's a medium for expressing other things, among them political points of view and positions in the political field. So I think what really helps in the long run will not entrust governments in sort of ensuring information quality. For me, this is like asking the fox to guard the hens, the chicken. What I think what we really need to care about is the future of the media landscape. That is what matters most. And that with regard to several things. First of all, paywalls might be helpful for single publishers today, but they're very bad, particularly for the young generation that will not subscribe to single newspapers anymore, and that also doesn't watch TV anymore. We need new business models, and we also need new sort of financial structures for ensuring high quality public broadcasting. And what I see is more or less the opposite. I sort of miss broad coalitions of professional media specialists looking at national solutions for a big problem that is more or less global. I've tried several times in Germany, and what I see is sort of opposing forces. One is it's the regional newspapers that die first, and the national ones with the big audience couldn't care less because they think for them that means a bigger market share. And second, they all think they will survive because they survived the fact that the social networks took away their advertising funding. For the time being, they're fine with their subscribers and they refuse to look in the future. And for me, it's sort of the automotive industry of tomorrow. They are just not, they don't look at their future, and that has serious democratic side effects because our understanding of democracy depends on a robust media landscape, and that will die if we don't do anything against this. So I will get back at the end to my point of Lisa Dish. We can handle disinformation when we have a very good, diverse public sphere where different points of views are taken notice of, and the young generation also learns that there is never one opinion and even facts can be seen very differently. This one needs to learn, and that is not a matter of digital literacy, but it really starts with a vibrant public sphere. And I haven't seen it yet, I heard of a study that makes the point that high quality media attract other high quality media. It sort of downscales and upscales on the quality ladder depending on who dominates the field. And that for me is sort of the crucial political question, how we ensure stop the downsizing of media and ensure a high quality public sphere for the future.
And all those recent international documents, the declarations I mentioned, they talk about the importance of having a vibrant traditional public sphere of media and so on, and how do you support that? But of course, how do you resource it, et cetera? And all the trends are opposite, it seems, right now. I was looking at the chat. I've seen Bill Dutton's made a couple of interesting comments. Bill, you don't want to get on this before I wrap to come to the close? Did you want to say anything or no?
Well, only to say I just think that people so often, whether it's vaccination debates or political debates, too often the people that promote disinformation do a better job. And it's very difficult to challenge ridiculous comments, that are, or claims, but we don't make enough effort. I mean, the common response to misinformation is that's not true, or there's no evidence of that. Okay, come on, provide the case against what this ridiculous point. We don't work at it. We assume that everybody knows the truth, and we only just have to refute it. That's not true. Anyway, but this was a great panel. I really, I've got so much I want to write about now after this. So thank you very much.
Great to hear that, Bill. Thanks. Len, a closing thought, and then we're going to wrap it up.
I want to agree totally with Jeanette, and I like what Bill said too. Just to remind you, there's type 1 and type 2 errors. We'll be talking about misinformation, but we haven't talked on the other side of the intermediaries has a type 2 error, because they will push things out that you want to hear that are wrong, that are right. So you've got to be very careful in this landscape.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks for that, Len. All right. So we have reached 28 after the hour, so I think probably we wrap it up. So hopefully panelists are comfortable with where they've stopped, because we're going to stop now. As always, I did think this was a lively and fun conversation. So thank you, everybody, for participating. As always, I want to thank Jason Buckwheats, the Executive Director of CITI, for managing the meeting logistics and so on. I want to remind you again that our final session of the semester will be December 12th, and we'll be talking about the Council of Europe's Convention on Artificial Intelligence with people who are directly involved in its negotiation, which I think should be fun. Okay, so I will stop and turn it back to Ellie for closing thought. Ellie.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you very much, panel. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, audience. I would say, being in academia, I've been surrounded for decades now with postmodernism, which proclaimed and tried to prove that there is no such thing as truth in the singular. It's truth in the plural. It depends on perspective and hierarchies and power structures and all kinds of stuff. Now, some of the same people are trying to tell me that there is such a thing as the truth, and anything that is outside of it is disinformation. So I'm a little confused. I would say, on the whole, that Jeanette's perspective on the vibrant public sphere is probably the way to go, as long as it does not mean supporting of the incumbents, like an incumbent protection. So the public sphere has to include also new voices, new styles, new outlets, etc. So once we can somehow look at what's missing and how do we make sure that it exists, I think we can have a vibrant public sphere, and people will have to drift to those outlets and that information that works for them, and kind of try to avoid the other one. Is this a perfect solution? Of course not. But I think in comparison to the other solutions, I don't see anything better around. And certainly not a regulated agency, kind of like a quasi-incipient ministry of truth that somehow rubber stamps what is correct and that is aided by AI mechanisms that will kind of in real time check everybody's statements and block them if they're misstatement, and create kind of no-fly lists of people who cannot talk and people who can talk. I mean, the technology makes all these controls possible. So we have to be really careful not to legitimize that particular slippery slope situation. So having said that, I'm really grateful to all of you for listening and speaking. And we will have another session. Bill, do you have the announcement on that?
Well, I just made it. It's the December 12th, Artificial Intelligence.
All right. So, all right. So we say goodbye to you from New York, and we'll see you a month from now. Bye-bye.
Yep. Bye-bye. Thanks again to the panelists and everybody else.
Bye all.